Hi everyone! This month's coding challenge is going to be using the language Python. We're going to be using it to create a word scramble game. Now the example we're going to be creating is quite simple, but if you need to learn more about Python, w3schools.com has a great section all about it. You should definitely check it out. Now Python is one of those languages that you usually need to have an offline editor and compiler in order to use, but there are some online versions that will work just fine. The one we're going to use today is called Repellent. The first couple lines of our code are importing some libraries. We'll need these later on in our code. Then we need to create a variable called words and fill it with random words. I picked wintry words because we're right in the thick of it now. You need to make sure any words that you add are separated by commas and are in double quotes. Now we want to add some graphics to our game. We want one to show up at the beginning when we start our game and also to show up at the end when we're done. So the way that we can do this in Python is using the print function. Now with Python, you can't add pictures and things like that, at least in this particular editor, so we have to use something called ASCII graphics. They're basically just images that are made using only text. If you do a Google search, you'll be able to find lots of different options. I'm just using a little snowman here. I'm going to add in some ASCII art of people shoveling for my end screen. Now we're going to define our first function, and that's going to be a function that's going to allow us to scramble our words. This function uses the list method in order to convert the word into individual characters. Then it uses the shuffle method to shuffle those characters around in a random order. Finally, those shuffled characters need to be joined back together into one single word, and then made all lowercase to make sure that the first letter isn't given away. Our next function is the game loop function. This is the main function that has all of the logic for our game. First, we set our score to 0, and then we create a loop. This loop will allow our game to play over and over again until the player decides they no longer want to play. Line 55 is where our loop starts. So while this loop continues to be true and the player wants to play the game, it will continue looping over and over again. After printing some instructions for the player, we use the choice method to pick a random word from our words variable at the top of the code. Next, we use our scramble word function to scramble that word up and give it back to us. Next, we have two variables, one called prompt, which will be where our scrambled word will be, and one called guess, which is an input field where the player will put their guess. Next, we need to use an if statement to determine if the player's answer is correct. If their guess matches the random word variable, we're going to print out that they're correct and increase the score by 1. If it doesn't match, we'll just print out that that's not quite right. After that, we want to print our score and ask the player if they want to try again. If the player selects Y or yes, the game will continue. If they select N or no, the loop will break and the game will end. If they choose something other than yes or no, they'll be told that it's an invalid choice. Lastly, we need to define our main function. This function will list all the other functions and the sequence that they play. At the very top, we need to seed the random function. We've used random throughout this game, but nothing with computers is truly random, so we need to give that random number a random number using the seed method. Seed, by default, uses the current date as the random number. Next, we want to define the sequence that our functions will play in. First, we want the display banner function to start, then the game loop to execute, and once the game is over, we want the display goodbye function to show up. If there's a problem playing any of these functions, we want to return an error code of 42. But if everything goes correctly, we want to return 0, which is a success code. The last bit of code that our game requires will allow us to define which function should be executed first. We obviously want the main function to come first because it gives the sequence of how all the other functions should run. Now let's run our code and see how it plays. I think this word is snow. Nope, not quite right, so I don't get a score, but I want to try again. That one looks like boots to me. And I'm right, so I get a score. But now I'm finished, so let's press no. And we can see that the end screen shows up with our goodbye. Looks pretty good. Happy coding!